I want to thank several people. Margaret already has, but I want to do it again because without them, I could not do this. First of all, Margaret handing, much of the technical intricacies of this. Without her, we couldn't do this. And I do want to shout out to Linda and Chester Freeman, who have been my dance teachers for almost 20 years or so and continue to be. And they're my inspiration. And if John Girolico is in the house, he is the director of the Elting Memorial Library in New Paltz. And so I need to thank him as well as the library itself. This is a library event. All of you had to register through the library to get here. So it's because of the library that this is being done. As we said, the name of the program is Harlem's Contribution to Black History in Music and Dance. What I'm going to do is give you some historical perspective on what's really happening today in terms of Lindy Hop. I know many of you are dancers. Many of you are familiar with Lindy Hop, but I wonder if you know where it came from and all of the ramifications, behind the formation of not only the dance, but the music. I'm about to give you that some of that perspective right now. But first, I need you to make 3 assumptions. All right. The first one is easy. I want you to assume that right now you're in New York City. Okay. Now, I assume most of you have been to New York City before at some time in your life, so that's not a difficult reach. All right. But you're in New York City right now. The second assumption is a bit harder. I want you to assume that not only are you in New York City, but it's the New York City of 1920, 1921. Okay, so we're going back 100 years or more. All right, there's a reason why I'm doing this, but to set it up, seeing as how I doubt that anybody out there was around in 1920, and even if you were, you're not old enough to remember it. So let me give you a few a little bit of perspective. It's 1920. The Great War is over. Now, we all know that as World War I, but obviously they didn't call it that in 1920. They'd have to be incredibly clairvoyant to do that. As far as they were concerned, this was a world war, okay? And they had reason to assume that there would never, ever be another war. In fact, it was called the war to end all wars. Why? Mostly because more people died in this war than in any war in history. And the weapons used in this war had never been used in a war before. Things like airplanes, flamethrowers, machine guns, tanks, etc. Terrible weapons, horrible weapons, but it's over. And Americans are euphoric about that. Number one, the war was not fought on their soil, even though many Americans did die in the war. But again, the war to end all wars has already been fought and won by us. That was the feeling in 1920. Also, 1920 was an election year, and women, for the first time, got to vote in a national election. All right, and that's a landmark event. The person elected president, Warren G. Harding, if you never heard of him, don't worry about it. He didn't do much. He died about, maybe a year or so in office, unfortunately. And I can't remember a single thing that he did of any significance, although I'm sure he was a great man. What else in 1920 is going on or has happened? Yes. January 1st, 1920, the Volstead Act went into effect. Oh, what's that? You don't know what the Volstead Act is? Well, otherwise known as prohibition. Okay. The law said that you could not manufacture, distribute, or sell alcohol. Oddly enough, there was no law against drinking it, but presumably the government assumed that if you couldn't manufacture, distribute, or sell it, nobody could drink it. How wrong they were. Okay, they were about to find out something very different, but that's another story. What else is going on in 1920? Oh, yeah, something that we might be familiar with. If you're walking around the streets of New York City in 1920, you would see people wearing masks. Okay, imagine that. The Spanish flu is just about over, although they didn't know it at the time. Okay, and they were smart enough to practice social distancing and wear masks and such just to protect themselves. This is a big deal. As many people as died in World War I, more people died as a result of the Spanish flu. But as I said, the feeling is that the Spanish flu was on the wane. You know, in 1920, people still wore masks, but, you know, things are subsiding. So happy days are about to appear again sooner or later. So that's 1920, and that should give you an idea of what things were like in 1920. Automobiles now outnumber, you know, horse-drawn, you know, vehicles and so on and so forth. There are many innovations, but people are basically happy. Also in 1920, all right? The third assumption I want you to make, and this is going to be difficult. Here's the assumption. You are all Black. Now, I'll give you a few seconds to absorb that, okay? It's New York City, you're in New York City, and you are Black. Oh, did I say Black? No, you're not Black. You're colored. You're Negro. Black wouldn't be beautiful for another 45 years. So if you were colored in New York City, you would be referred to as colored or Negro, all right? And you'd be happy with that because that was the way it was back then. Also, if you were Black in New York City, chances are you lived in a place called Harlem, okay? Harlem had been around, for 300 years since the days of the Dutch. All right. And it had been basically a bedroom community of New York City for about 300 years. Reason for that being, even though Harlem is in Manhattan, it is too far away from the business end of Manhattan for, you know, people to be able to get to work on time. It was that simple. If you don't know where Harlem is, I believe Margaret has a map that will show you pretty much in relation to the rest of Manhattan where Harlem is. Oh, there we are. There's West Harlem, Central Harlem, and East Harlem. Okay, Harlem basically is north of 110th Street, okay, which is the northern border of Central Park, south of 155th Street, although a little piece of Harlem sticks up above 155th Street to the Polo Grounds, or where the Polo Grounds used to be. Technically, Harlem goes from river to river. On the east side, it's the East River or the Harlem River at that point. And on the west, you have the Hudson River. But you see that there's West Harlem and East Harlem. That's important because by 1920, Harlem is basically a colored neighborhood, but not entirely. At no point in time was Harlem all Black. West Harlem and Manhattanville, Morningside Heights, that area, okay, is populated mostly in 1920 by the Irish. By the Irish and Puerto Ricans, by the way. Puerto Ricans flooded into the area as a result of the Spanish-American War, which made Puerto Rico American territory and not Spanish territory. East Harlem, also infiltrated by a lot of Puerto Ricans, was also home for many, many Jews and Italians that stayed in Harlem for decades. But the shaded area, Central Harlem, roughly from 110th Street all the way up to 155th Street, and on the east side from Lenox Avenue all the way over to the west side, around Convent Avenue, thereabouts, and parts of Amsterdam Avenue, if you're familiar with New York, was about 70% Black, or I should say colored. That's where colored people lived in New York in 1920. Not that colored people didn't live elsewhere, okay? There were other colored neighborhoods, or I should say neighborhoods where colored people could live. Keep in mind, 1920, it's New York. It's not the Deep South, but in 1920, New York is basically a segregated city. So if you were colored, and you are, okay, you don't have a lot of choice as to where you're going to live. Harlem is the biggest area, and it would become the biggest Black American district in the country, if not the world. Okay, you can take down the map now. I think people have the idea as to where Harlem is. And the history of Harlem, I won't go into, but it's varied, and I could spend hours talking about it. But I will mention how Harlem got to have so many colored people living there at one time, and still to this day. As I mentioned earlier, Harlem was basically a village, okay, a bedroom community of New York City, populated mostly by well-to-do people. There were mansions in Harlem, estates in Harlem, broad lawns. People sailed their sailboats in the Harlem River. They actually played polo in the polo grounds. That's why it was built. Okay, but a curious thing happened in 1904. The New York subway opened. It opened for a reason. Land developers wanted to develop Harlem for apartment buildings and so on and so on, and so on and so forth, for profit. And before the subway, they had no way to get there easily. Even though there was an elevated subway in New York, going back to the 1870s, it was slow, and it was rather dangerous to take an L train in 1872. Okay, so they figured that if they had a subway, okay, things would work a lot faster. So they built the subway. They started in 1903, patterned after the tube system in London, and by 1904, it opened. First subway train, the IRT, Interborough Rapid Transit. It went from City Hall to 145th Street, which is in Harlem. And that was planned because the transportation now reached to Harlem, and you can go to Harlem, you know, from Harlem down to Midtown Manhattan about as fast then as you could now on the subway. It made the area north of 110th Street all the way up to 155th Street valuable land. So what happened, they built apartment buildings, and they were spacious. Some of them had elevators, they had steam heat, they had dumbwaiters, all the conveniences that colored people back then did not have. At the time, colored people were living in what was known as a Hell's Kitchen. That was on the west side, the West 50s, the West 60s. There was another area just north of there called San Juan Hill, called that because of all the battles between the colored people and the Irish that also lived there. And it was named after the famous battle in the Spanish-American War. Things were not good, you know, for Black people, colored people living there. Okay, they lived mostly in railroad flats, and called such simply because if you've been in a railroad train, you have one long corridor with apartments, rooms, whatever, off to the side. Okay, and that's basically what the living conditions were like. You probably had a communal bathroom down at the end of the hall. No place to put garbage, so it was generally thrown out the window into a backyard or whatever. Living conditions were not good. So when the apartments opened up in Harlem for colored people, and the reason why they were open for colored people is because they were originally open for white people, but they figured they could make a lot more money from colored people. A, by jacking up the rents, and B, there were more colored people in terms of, ethnic, grouping than there were white people if you segmented them by, their, ethnicity. So the more colored people they could bring in, the more they could elevate the rents. And they actually tried to, recruit a lot of colored people, as many as possible, to come to Harlem, simply to drive some of the white people out. And they were only partially successful. Okay, as I said, Harlem was never a colored community entirely, but Central Harlem basically was. So once colored people started moving into Harlem, they made it their own. They kind of had to. New York in 1920 for a colored person would have seemed very strange to those of us today. If you were colored and you were walking downtown, you could expect to be stopped by a police officer asking you what you were doing there. Perhaps not unkindly, but colored people just didn't belong downtown. You had no business there. And the reason you had no business there is because chances are you could not walk into a store and be served the way anyone else would. For example, if a woman walked into a clothing store and wanted to buy a hat, she had to know what size she wore, because if she put it on her head, she bought it. A man could not go into a store and buy a jacket, because if he put it on, he bought it. You were not allowed to try it on. If you wanted to go to a restaurant, good luck. You would not be served. Not at all. You'd be lucky to get in the door. If they had a doorman, you wouldn't. If they didn't have a doorman, you might be able to sneak in and sit at a table, but you would just not be served. That would last up until the 1940s in New York City. So if you were colored and you lived in Harlem, chances are you spent most of your time in Harlem, unless you worked outside of Harlem. Harlem had its own churches, its own schools. It had its own restaurants, its own clothing stores, department stores, and so on and so forth. If you wanted to, you never had to leave Harlem if you were colored. Everything you needed was right there. So Harlem became its own self-contained community, had its own newspaper. I remember reading that newspaper when I was a kid, the Amsterdam News. It's probably still in circulation. Also in Harlem, seeing as how colored people had to make it its own, at the time, starting before the turn of the century, amusement was extremely important. Amusement mostly in the form of dance and music. Turn of the century, it was ragtime, and ragtime was all the rage. And there were any number of dances circulating around ragtime music. But ragtime morphed into what became known as jazz music. Not jazz, jazz, Jass. Okay. And it was danceable music. And it was not just colored people that danced that music. People all over the country were dancing to ragtime and eventually jazz music. There was a great need for musicians. There was a very great need for dance teachers. It was the age of dancing. People danced. If you had discretional funds, you went to a dance teacher and learned how to do the newest dance. And there were lots of them to be had. So in Harlem, people danced. They danced for all sorts of reasons, mostly because it was fun. I suspect that because life was tough for Harlemites, okay, you danced to forget your troubles, but you danced. The musicians flocked to New York and Harlem, as well as other places. Part of the Great Migration. People were still coming into Harlem from the South for better jobs and to get away from Jim Crow. They brought their music with them. And the musicians followed because that's where the money was. New York City was a great haven for musicians from all over the country, basically the South. The record industry was booming at the time with all kinds of blues and jazz records that people were listening, buying, and dancing to. There were dance halls in Harlem, many of them. The ones I'm familiar with, Rockland Palace on 155th Street and 8th Avenue. Okay, I forget when it was built, probably around the time of World War I, but people went there and danced. They didn't just dance, they used the halls for political rallies and things of that nature, but any excuse for a dance. The Savoy Ballroom, which I'll talk about at length a little later, was built in 1926 in Harlem for the same reason, dancing. Simply because if you were colored, you could not dance downtown. The big dance hall downtown was Roseland. It was huge. It had two bandstands, one at either end. And it was there primarily for dancing. And it was very popular and very lucrative if you were white. You could not go in if you were colored. So again, Harlemites, colored people, built their own, and that was the Savoy Ballroom, 1926, and it was almost immediately successful with the dance of the day, okay, which for a couple of years was the Charleston. It was written by a guy named James P. Johnson, a stride pianist, very good pianist. In fact, he was the mentor for a guy named Thomas Fats Waller, okay, who was born in Harlem. But the Charleston kind of swept the country, but not as long as people thought it did. The Charleston only lasted about 3 or 4 years until it kind of morphed into other dances. And even when the Charleston was popular, it was certainly not the only dance that was popular, across the country, but particularly in Harlem. So hopefully I've set the stage for what Harlem and New York City was like back in, the 1920s or so. The music is all important. The record industry is kind of booming, but the music is changing. The 20s were also known as an era of gimmicks and tricks and things of that nature, one of which was marathon dancing. A marathon dance, in case you don't know, is a dance where you get a whole bunch of people in a hall and you dance until you drop. Last couple standing gets the prize, although that's not the only way that you get money. If you're in a marathon dance and a crowd shows up, etc., and you can do a specialty dance and the crowd likes it, they threw money at you and you scooped it up. And that's kind of how you made money doing the marathon dance. I believe it was 1928. I forget the exact date. At the Rockland Palace, there is a charity marathon dance. And one of the people dancing there was a guy you need to know about. You need to hear about this guy. His name was George Snowden. He was called Shorty George because he was barely 5 feet tall. But he was a professional dancer, known throughout Harlem. That's how he made his money. It was back in the days when you could make a lot of money just dancing. And he was an extremely innovative dancer, okay? And at the Rockland Palace, you might call him a ringer, okay? Because he's bound to come up with specialty dances and that sort of thing. And that's exactly what he did. It was one day, I believe in June of 1928, he's there, Shorty George, and his partner, whose name escapes me. He had several partners, but his partner this particular day, I should know, but I don't. In any case, the reporters show up, crowd shows up, and he does his specialty dance, which he and his partner had rehearsed. And the crowd went wild, as the saying goes. The reporters wanted to know what he was doing. What he did was a breakaway. In those days, when you danced, you held your partner in a closed position. You didn't let her go. Or if you did, you didn't let her go for long. Shorty George let her go. He held on to her with one hand, but there were extended periods of time when they were at double arm's length. This was radical. The reporters wanted to know what he was doing. He not only did that, but he did a few steps after that. And that's what the reporters wanted to know about. What are you doing? What kind of new dance is that? Again, he wasn't the first one to break away from his partner, but he was the first one to popularize it. There were people that had never seen this before. And like I said, it was radical for 1928. Well, as the story goes, when they asked him what kind of dance was that, he turned and said, Lindy Hop. Now, did he actually say that? I don't know. I would guess that he did. Frankie Manning, whose name I will mention periodically from now on, another swing dancer in the era, says that he quoted Shorty George Snowden as saying, I'm doing the hop, the Lindy Hop. Now, why Lindy Hop? Well, Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic the year before. And for the longest time, Lindbergh's name, Lindy, that was his nickname, was, part of the headlines of just about every major newspaper in the country. Everybody knew who Lindbergh was. Lindbergh was a national hero. People were naming everything Lindbergh or Lindy. So it was not unusual for Shorty George to name this thing that he was doing, Lindy Hop. Again, did he actually say that? No one really knows, but I'll, go by what Frankie Manning had to say about it. And he said that Shorty George told him that's exactly what he said. Now that's 1928. And Lindy Hop, as we know it, actually, it seems like that dance should have burst out and become popular immediately, but it didn't. And it didn't because the music wasn't ready for it. I have a clip of Shorty George that we'll show now. There are actually three dancers or three couples dancing. Pay attention to the third couple. That is Shorty George and his partner.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, this evening, we are carrying on with a dancing festival which has been going on here for almost a year. Tonight is the lineament, the finals of the lineament, and all the different people which are dancing in this thing is going to start in tonight and find out which one is the best. Now, the first couple I'm calling off here this evening is Hotfoot Benny and that dashing little lady friend, Lizzie Highfly. Couple number two, Mr. Oliver Hemingway and Buzzsaw Mamie. Couple number three, Shorty Stump and Liza Underdunk.
Sorry, that seemed very choppy there, such as the the action of using YouTube through Zoom. But hopefully you did see, some of what they were doing. You did see them break away, although not much If you notice Shorty George, he did break away, but he had a double hand hold and so on and so forth. If you listen to the music is not conducive to Lindy Hop. Not really. I suppose you could Lindy Hop to it if you wanted to, but most Lindy Hoppers didn't want to or wouldn't have wanted to. That clip was made in 1929, 2 years, or actually 1 year after Shorty George did his, Lindy Hop premiere performance. By the way, if you notice that the band leader was in blackface, there's a reason for that. Back then, a white musician and a colored musician could not appear on stage in public together. So either the band leader was white. So in order for that clip to even be legal, okay, not that you'd be jailed, but there would be trouble, with the musicians union, he had to black up so that everybody in the film that you saw was quote unquote colored, just to pass, through the censors. The music is not atypical of music of the time. In fact, I think I've got some music queued up that, will kind of give you an idea of what music was like back then to dance to. And I'll leave it up to you to determine whether or not it's Lindy Hoppable or not. Again, we're talking late 20s, early 30s, and this music would be typical. I assume you can hear that. Okay, I won't play the whole thing. Time, kind of forbids that. But if you went to any of the dance halls in Harlem or anywhere else for that matter, that's what you would expect to hear. Kind of a rambling, walking type of strut. Okay, not unusual. They did have faster tunes that they would play, but again, if you were a Lindy Hopper, you would, pretty much not dance to that today. I'll play another selection for you. That was Fletcher Henderson, by the way, and I'll mention his name a little later. One more selection. Okay, I'd like to, keep that going, but again, I think you get the idea. It's very typical of the late 1920s, also early 1930s, but music isn't swinging yet, not quite yet. Several things have to happen. What made music in Harlem and everywhere else very popular were record sales. Okay, so if you liked the song, you went out and bought the record. That's, nothing new. But it's getting towards the 1930s. 1929, when that Shorty George clip was made, the stock market crashed. All of a sudden, happy times are no longer here. People can no longer afford records. Record sales in 1927 was 104 million. By 1923, it dropped to 7.4 million. And when you think about it, how else do you popularize music? Musicians are hurting. Okay, people can no longer afford the music. What musicians are doing, however, is experimenting with music. Musicians always experiment with music, even today. So the sweet music that you heard just now, those two selections, again, typical of late 20s, 1930s, will not last. Musicians like Fletcher Henderson, who did that first selection, Benny Goodman. In fact, most musicians are experimenting with what they are beginning to call swing music. Now, swing at the time was a musician's term. In fact, I believe the first time that term was used, was when Duke Ellington's trumpet player, Bubba Miley, told Duke that, I guess whimsically, if it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. He literally said that, but he said it in 1924. What we consider to be swing music will have to wait 10 years for it to swing the way we're used to listening to music swing. Anyway, Benny Goodman, you've heard of him. He is one of many band leaders struggling in the early part of the Depression. In 1934, he was lucky enough to get a contract in New York City to play on the radio. Radio is important. If we don't have records, we do have radio. And on radio, music is free. And by 1933, radio stations have been syndicated, meaning a company can own any number of radio stations across the country and string them together in terms of playing a particular program that everybody across the country can hear through the radio stations around the country. So what happened with Benny Goodman in New York City, he got a contract to play his music. He wasn't the only one. There were 3 orchestras that got the same contract to play music. The problem was that by the time Goodman, who had been experimenting with what we would call swing music, by the time he got on the air, it was 12:30 at night. Nobody or hardly anybody in New York heard him. What he didn't realize is that the station, the program was syndicated, and they heard him loud and clear in California, where it was only 9:30. He didn't know this. There was an employee strike that caused the contract to cancel after the first night. He was booked to do a cross-country tour, but the tour really didn't do well. He struggled along. At the time, he played music everywhere he went, but the music was sweet music. It was kind of like the music that I played for you earlier. It didn't swing. He was playing mostly to middle-aged people who, would just want to move around the floor, perhaps do a foxtrot or two or whatever. So he's barely making it. Long story short, he gets to California, Los Angeles, the Palomar Ballroom. He goes into his repertoire of sweet music, like he had, that was his bread and butter, and the crowd booed him. Unbeknownst to him, most of the crowd were young people, and they had heard his New York City syndicated performance of swing music. And they said they want to hear, the swing music, et cetera, et cetera. This was experimental. Goodman didn't know what he was going to do. And reportedly, his drummer, Gene Krupa, said, Well, if we're going to go out, we may as well go out with a bang. So what they did was they used a lot of the arrangements that they had bought from, guess who? Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson was the person that played that first selection of sweet music, late 1920s music. He was a great musician, great orchestra leader, terrible with money, lost his band, and hired himself to Goodman and other people as an arranger. He would get his band back later on, but for now, he's arranging music for Goodman, and Goodman hadn't been playing it at all across the country. Now he's going to play it because he really has no choice. He plays it. The crowd goes wild. Keep in mind, at the Palomar Ballroom, there were several thousand people. And that, particular, band date, if I can find it in my notes, is important because that is the day that everybody recognized this as the music that they want to hear, is basically the day that swing began. In other words, most musicologists will say that on this particular date, and I believe it was August 21st, 1935, that's the day swing began. Now, in actuality, did people play swing? Sure. Okay, Cab Calloway did. Duke Ellington did. Other band leaders did. But Benny Goodman was white, and he had an audience of several thousand people. And because of that, he is known as the King of Swing simply because he's the first one to popularize swing music across the country. And that's exactly what he did. Now, what's happening in Harlem in the meantime? Remember the Savoy Hotel? I had the Savoy Ballroom that I said I'd get back to? It's the center point of dance in Harlem. In Harlem, they are doing Lindy Hop. Why? Shorty George lives in Harlem, and he had his own dance troupe, and he had popularized Lindy Hop in the early 30s all around New York City. Now, there's another guy at the Savoy Ballroom, which by now is a big deal. Built in 1926, it's now 1935. It's 9 years later. The Savoy Ballroom is the center point of Harlem dance and music. And there's a guy there who was an ex-boxer and an ex-bouncer at the Savoy. And rather than be a bouncer, he decided that he wanted to promote Lindy Hop. His name is Herbert White. He was called Whitey. He was called Whitey because of his name and because he had a white streak in his hair. And he was a very interesting guy. And he noticed that at the Savoy, there were people that danced. Well, everybody danced, but there were people that danced very, very well. And he saw an opportunity, an economic opportunity here. Now, the Savoy Ballroom. You have to picture this, and we'll show you a clip in a minute of what the Savoy Ballroom looked like. But picture this, a whole city block, mahogany floor, has to be replaced every 3 years for all the people dancing on it. Bandstand at one end, another bandstand at the other end, copied after, Roseland, although the Savoy is bigger than Roseland. As I mentioned, the center point of Harlem dance and Harlem music. Every weekend night, the Savoy Ballroom is hopping. It's 1934, 1935. Benny Goodman is on the West Coast or heading towards the West Coast, okay? And swing will be big once Benny Goodman finishes. Swing is big in Harlem. Lindy Hop is big in Harlem. There are people doing all sorts of innovations, including a kid named Frankie Manning, who in 1935 was only 19 years old. Shorty George is a half generation older than Frankie and has taken his, dance troupe on the road. Whitey, of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, he will form Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, and he has noticed that Frankie Manning and several other dancers are better than average. Now, if you were to go to the Savoy in 1935, 1936, thereabouts, you'd get in, you'd dance, But you might notice that there are people that are better than other people, and they dance at a particular spot at the Savoy Ballroom near the bandstand. Everybody called it the Cat's Corner, except the people that actually dance there. This is where the best dancers worked out their steps. Now, if you were at the Savoy and you didn't know this, and you noticed there were really good people dancing at this particular spot, the Cat's Corner, and wanted to dance there, that would be fine for a while. You'd dance, and all of a sudden somebody would bump into you, accidentally, of course, and they'd say, "Excuse me," and you continued dancing. And well, maybe a minute or so later, you get kicked in the shins, or somebody would step on your foot. After a while, you'd notice this is not an accident. This is a message being sent to you that you don't dance at the Cat's Corner unless you're invited to by Herbert White. He owned it, and he invited the best dancers to dance there and practice their steps in preparation for what he's about to do. So people like Frankie Manning, like I said, Frankie Manning's a kid, okay? Norma Miller is a kid. There are people in the neighborhood, people in the Harlem neighborhood that are really good at this, but they're young, okay? The inevitable was bound to happen. Shorty George, the old man, he's in his early 30s, but he's the old man of dance, notices Frankie Manning, who's the younger generation. And soon enough, a challenge is, thrown down between Shorty George and Frankie Manning. Frankie Manning talked about this when he was in Kingston some years ago, and he's nervous about it. After all, Shorty George is the big man on campus. He's been in Harlem for years dancing, and everybody knows who he is. Nobody knows who Frankie Manning is, okay? And yet, he has accepted a challenge to a dance-off with against Shorty George. Frankie noticed something, however, about Shorty George. Shorty George danced all over the place, and one of his specialty dances, one of his partners, was a woman called Big B. Big B was over 6'2". Frankie Manning was barely 5 feet tall, so you can understand and imagine the comic image that the two pose when they dance together. But at the end of their dance, Big B would pick Frankie up on her back and carry him off. And Frankie would be waving his hands and, struggling and whatnot. Big comedy routine. Everybody laughed and everybody knew that routine.
That was Shorty George dancing with Big B.
I'm sorry, who did I say? Frankie? It was
Frankie.
Shorty George. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah.
Frankie, however, noticed this, and it gave him an idea. I believe his partner was Norma Miller for this. Correct me if I'm wrong. But he got with Norma Miller, who is about a year younger than him, with an idea. And the idea he got from Shorty George being carried off by, Big B. And he's going to spring it on Shorty George at the Savoy Ballroom. What he did was, the day of the contest is here. Shorty George went first. He wowed the crowd, as everybody expected. Now the kid is up, Frankie and Norma Miller. They're dancing. They're doing the best they can with their Lindy Hop, when all of a sudden, Norma Miller runs up behind Frankie, jumps up on his back, flips over his back, and lands in front of him, okay, in step. It was the first aerial, although in those days they called it an air step. The crowd went wild. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. It was almost like what Shorty George did several years before with the breakaway. Nobody had seen that either. Frankie had invented something that the crowd had never seen. Because of that, he won the contest, and his star is on the rise. What Herbert White proceeded to do is to train these people with discipline have them practice as often as they could. And he sent them out throughout the city, throughout the state, throughout the country, and throughout the world to popularize Lindy Hop. It did not take long for that to happen. Simply because, as I mentioned earlier, the Savoy is the epicenter of dance. And it wasn't long before everybody, black, white, or whatever, ended up at the Savoy, okay, to dance and to be seen. I have another clip about the Savoy that'll show you what the Savoy looks like, at least from the outside, and some more explanations about what the Savoy meant.
The Savoy covered a whole city block on Lenox Avenue between 140th and 141st Streets, employed 2 bands at once so that the music need never stop, and was so popular with dancers that its maple and mahogany floor had to be replaced every 3 years. Just 50 cents on weeknights, 75 cents on Sundays. The Savoy was called the home of happy feet and offered depression-ravaged Harlem a respite from its troubles.
The windows was wide open, and so the music can come out, blast right into our living room. Every night we heard this marvelous music. And in those days, in the summer, the fire escape was where you sat to be cool. There was no air conditioning, nowhere. So by sitting on a fire escape, and our fire escape faced the back windows of the Savoy Ballroom. And you ever see shadows when people dance past the windows? You can see figures dancing to that music. And my sister and I would respond to what we saw in the windows of the Savoy, and we would get into the living room and dance to some of the best bands in the world.
For years, Norma listened to the music and dreamed of going inside. In the spring of 1931, she got her chance.
Precisely, it was Easter Sunday, 12 years old. And you know, in those days, you always had a new outfit to go out to church. 4 o'clock, there's a matinee going to be at the Savoy Ballroom. And after church, I dashed up to Lenox Avenue. And the people that went into the Savoy were sharp. And we used to just stand outside to watch them, and that's what I was doing. We started dancing outside the Savoy Ballroom. And I heard somebody say to me, "Hey, kid." And I turned around, and he said, you. And then I turned around, and I recognized immediately who it was. It was the great Twist Mouth George in a white hat, white suit, white everything, asking me to come up to the ballroom to dance with him. And he said, "Would you come and dance?" I said, "Would I?" He grabbed me, we dashed up the stairs. And I don't know whether I hit each step, because he had such long legs. And I remember just flying up those stairs with him. And you go through these doors. And I think it was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen in my life. The reds and the greens and the blues. And that was the first time I ever saw a band on a bandstand. I mean, I'd been seeing the shadows. And I'm so excited. He took me over there in the corner and sat me down and brought me a Coke and said, "You sit here and I'll come and get you." And finally, it was his turn for Twist Mouth George to come, and he came and got me, and he said, "Let's go." When they hit that music, all I know is I did everything. He just threw me out. My feet never touched the ground. Was screaming, and he put me on top of his shoulders, walked me around the ballroom, and the people is clapping and talking about Twist Mouth, and he took me right around to the front, right outside, and put me back outside. Greatest moment in my life, and I'm excited. I'm gonna go home and tell my mother and my sister. And then I said, no, I better not say nothing.
That's a little snippet of the Savoy. Let's say, and again, we're all colored, We're all in New York. It's 1935. We want to go to the Savoy. But wait, you can't just walk in. If you're female, you have to have your best dress on. You have to have a hat. You have to look like something. If you're male, your shoes need to be polished. Your slacks need to be ironed. Your suit needs to be pressed. You can wear any shirt you want, as long as it's white. You better have a tie on. Bow tie would pass. Even better if you have a vest, and you better have your jacket on. And by the way, put on your fedora. Homburg would work. That's how you got into the Savoy Ballroom. Of course, you had to pay your 50 cents. If it was Sunday, it was 75 cents. Again, this is a depression. It's a lot of money, but it was worth it just to get into the Savoy. Once you walked in, you walked into a cacophony of sound. You had a band at one end and a band ready to play at the other. If you were band number 2, you played band number 1's last song with them. And once they got off the bandstand, you launched into song number 2. None of this fiddling around with sheet music or tuning up instruments. If you did that, you never showed up at the Savoy again in a band. You had to be ready to play as soon as that other band was off. There might be 1,000 people in there. Keep in mind, this is a whole city block, wide. And the only question that anybody need ask is, can you dance? After a while, the Savoy got a reputation for being the number 1 place to dance in New York City, if not the country. And that's stretching it a little bit, but certainly in New York City. After the initial 1935-36, again, while Shorty George and Frankie Manning are tuning up Lindy Hop at the Savoy, Benny Goodman is coming back. Other band leaders are revving up their arrangements of swing music. Keep in mind, it took about 8 years for the music to catch up with Lindy Hop. Lindy Hop invented June 20th, 1928, but it didn't become popular across the country until August 21st, 1935. That's the Palomar date that Benny Goodman played at, which popularized swing music. So most people consider the swing era to last from 1935 until 1947. After that, other things happened. But let's get back to the Savoy. Again, as I said, the Savoy, the preeminent place to dance Lindy Hop. If you were a Lindy Hopper in New York, you had to go to the Savoy. You had to be there. And it didn't matter whether you were black, white, or what. Nobody cared. The only thing that mattered is, can you dance? Are you willing to dance? People would ride the subway for hours just to get up to 141st Street and Lenox Avenue, where the Savoy Ballroom was. Now, keep in mind, New York is still a segregated city by and large, not by legislation. This is not the Deep South, but the political powers that be are not happy that the races are mixing, at the Savoy Ballroom. However, Harlem has political power of its own, and it's able to keep the Savoy open and free of trouble, for almost all of its history. There was one time when the Savoy was closed, however, in 1943, race riot. Not because of the Savoy, but because of the long, hot summer, police harassment. And 1943, there are troop ships in the Hudson River, GIs waiting to go overseas to fight the Nazis, many of them from the South, and many of them not used to seeing colored people walking around as if they owned the place, which they did. They were in Harlem. Riots happened, and the Savoy, it was used as an excuse to close the Savoy down, but not for long. Savoy was closed for maybe a week or so, not quite sure. Okay. But it was soon open. Again, Harlem had its own political clout and was able to keep it open. So again, and by this time, 1943, I'm jumping ahead a few years, Lindy Hop is everywhere. Lindy Hop has actually crept into Hollywood. At first, white people were doing Lindy Hop on the screen, but by the 1940s, they couldn't avoid having colored people do what they did best. By now, Frankie Manning and the troupe have been all over the country and are now in Hollywood. And we have a clip showing you Lindy Hop at its finest.
Think might turn into something. I'm mistaken. Here comes something now. Think might turn into something. I'm mistaken. Here comes something now.
Unfortunately, that was all stop action. I have to speak to the Zoom people about that. You should have seen that in its full action, and you can Google that on YouTube and watch it the way it should be seen. But what you saw was Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, and if you notice the guy in the coveralls that got kicked, forward, that was Frankie Manning, and that was taken from Hells a Poppin' 1941. And as I said, by now, Lindy Hop is all the rage, and they cannot avoid putting colored people on film to do it right. Not that there weren't a lot of white people doing a really good job of Lindy Hop in the movies in the 1930s and early 40s and so on and so forth. But, let's get the people that pretty much innovated it on the screen, and they did. That was 1941, Hells a Poppin', and again, the film clip is available. I'll hurry the rest of it up because the swing era is just about over. Like I said, from 1935 until 1947. Lots of things happened after that. Jazz no longer was popular music. It was now listener music that you had to understand rather than move to. So we need to jump to the 1980s when there were several people, groups of people in various parts of the world, California, New York, England, Sweden, watching movies such as you just saw, wondering how to do this. Where are those people? Can anyone teach us? They knew Frankie Manning's name, and I think it was a guy named Steve Mitchell who in New York kind of looked at the phone book at all the Frankie Mannings that might be there and, to find Frankie Manning to teach them Lindy Hop. He was successful. And as the story goes, he calls Frankie Manning on the phone, not knowing if it's the right one. And he says, "Is this Frankie Manning, the dancer?" And he answered, "No, it's Frankie Manning, the postal worker." Frankie Manning, was drafted in World War II, came back, tried to get his dance troupe back together again. No go with that. Things have changed. So he got a job at the post office, worked there until retirement, until he got the phone call from Steve Mitchell. What Steve tried to do is to get Frankie to just show him a few steps. And Frankie, being the nice guy that he was, said, "All right, come on over. I'll show you a few things." The rest is history. They got Frankie out of retirement. They got him to teach Lindy Hop. Long story, very short. Frankie ended up teaching all over the world. Big resurgence in Lindy Hop from the 1980s until the present time. Lots of people are doing Lindy Hop. I can't tell you how many dance weekends I've gone to, how many lessons I've taken, and how many people there are that do Lindy Hop today. So even though it was kind of hidden a little bit, they did it in the 50s to early rock and roll until it was replaced by the mashed potato and the twist and so on and so forth. And by the way, the twist, if you've seen the twist, was Lindy Hop that taught Chubby Checker how to do that. Okay, her name was Sugar Sullivan. And the twist is actually the first two steps and the last three steps of a swing out, a stylized swing out done by the follower. So the influence of Lindy Hop has always been there. Like I said, today it is probably bigger than it was in the 30s. Now that might be hyperbole, but believe it or not, Lindy Hop is a big deal today. If you want to learn how to do Lindy Hop, that is certainly doable. Linda and Chester can take care of that. Okay. Is there more to the story? Did I cut out a lot of it? Yes, I had to. As I said, time is of the essence, and I'm already about over time. Sorry about that. So I think I'll end my lecture now. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd certainly like to hear them. And Margaret, if you can orchestrate that so that
you can pop them in the chat box. The chat box is now open.
Okay, let's see what's in the chat box.
It'll take people a few minutes. I know it can take a minute or two to type out your questions. So we'll give everyone a minute or two. I want to, while people are typing out their questions, I want to thank you, Ron, for giving this presentation.
Oh, no problem.
It's incredible how you can just, most people, I need something to back me up. I need a PowerPoint. I need something. You can just go, and that's very impressive.
My problem
thank you for doing this.
My problem is not what to include, is what to leave out.
Yeah.
And I have to, kind of check myself. Otherwise, I'll go on all night long with what amounts to trivia. Let's see what's here.
Okay, so the first question I have is, where does the jitterbug come in? You did a superb job, Addie.
Well, thank you very much. There are lots of names for Lindy Hop, okay? And not to complicate things, but there are regional differences in the dance. That's where jitterbug comes from. Some people say jitterbug is synonymous with Lindy Hop. It is not. Some people say it is synonymous with East Coast swing, which is kind of a watered down Lindy Hop. That's probably closer to the truth. But again, when you're talking about dance, you're talking about regional differences within the same dance across the country. So jitterbug, the term comes from, it's a jive term. It's a Lindy Hop term, okay, used by musicians and such like that. But it does referred to a Lindy Hop East Coast swing type of dance, which is probably regional.
Okay, thank you. Vivian says, Ron, first of all, I miss dancing with you. I miss dancing with Ron too. Secondly, you did an amazing job with this presentation. I certainly learned a few new things. Deborah and Michael say, thank you, Ron. This was fantastic. See you on the dance floor. Mary says, this was wonderful with multiple exclamation points. Anne says, thank you. Elizabeth has a video from last year. Elizabeth, if you would like to send that to the library at events@eltinglibrary.org, we would love to have that. Mary says it was wonderful. Oh, can I unmute you? Let's unmute you.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes. You are. Go for
Okay.
it, Linda. This is
Great.
Linda once again of Got to Lindy Dance Studios.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This has been such a great honor to partner with the Elton Library to present Ron, who, if you ever play trivia, you want on your team because he knows everything. So I do need, as Ron's teacher, to make 2 corrections. Ron.
Yes.
Frankie did the first air step with Frida Washington, not Norma Miller.
Oh, I thought it was Norma Miller. Okay, I was waiting for somebody to correct me on that because I wasn't sure.
I couldn't unmute myself. I was trying. And the other correction is the famous phone call to Frankie Manning to get him out of retirement was not Stephen Mitchell.
Oh.
He was with his partner, Erin Stevens. She made the phone call.
Oh, okay. And I have one correction also. Mattie Purnell, it was Shorty George's partner for the breakaway in 1920, not the breakaway, but in 1929, that After Zeben clip that we saw, that was Mattie Purnell, if that's what you were asking earlier.
Okay, a lot of people saying how much they loved tonight and they learned new things, which is always our goal with library programming. From Mary, Ron, you painted a great picture. Question, the first clip from 1929 showing the swing out had me thinking of Balboa. Was Balboa that period? Any relationship to?
No, Balboa came out later, okay, in the 1930s in California, actually Balboa Island. And a quick history on that, when Lindy Hop got to be very popular, especially with the breakaway and the swing out, it takes up a lot of room, which decreases the number of people you can fit in the club. Club owners didn't like that, so they banned the swing out. The kids at the time said, all right, if we're not gonna do the swing out, then we'll do what is really a very close, fast dance called Balboa, and that's where Balboa came from. Balboa Island, where it was first done, it's the middle 1930s, and it was done in response to, the ban on the swing out.
Okay, Melinda asks, are there more photos of the interior of the Savoy Ballroom?
I haven't found any. You could look on the internet to see, check out YouTube. But no, I haven't been able to find any. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I haven't seen any.
Okay, more people telling me how awesome you are, which I know to be true. Do we have any last questions out there? Any?
I was reading a question and then it disappeared. It says, thank you so much, Ron and Linda and Chester. That was wonderful. A breath of fresh air. There was a question that I was reading and all of a sudden it disappeared. The first clip from 1929 showing the swing out made me think of Balboa. Okay.
That was the question. Yep. A new one is from Dina. When Frankie was at Mohonk, meaning Mohonk Mountain House, were you there? Did you ever see him dance live, be it in the Savoy?
No, sorry to say, the Savoy is before my time. From where I grew up in Harlem, I could walk the Savoy in 10 minutes had I known it was there. I just didn't. By the time I learned about the Savoy, they had torn it down. It was torn down in 1956, actually. So I never knew anything about, what I lectured on. Sorry to say, I wish I had, but nope, I never danced at the Savoy. Sorry to say, that would have been something to brag about.
But you did see Frankie when we brought him here.
I did see Frankie when he came here. He came to Kingston, New York. Linda and Chester Freeman invited him, and he did come, and he had lots of stories to tell. And I still remember those. That reminds me, Linda, do you have the picture of?
I do.
Margaret
I will
does.
screen share very quickly.
Okay. In lieu of the Savoy Ballroom, there's a monument to the Savoy on Lenox Avenue. And guess who that is in front? Linda and Chester Freeman. Okay. But if you're ever in Harlem on 141st to 142nd Street, take a look at that. I have yet to do that.
All right, let's check in. Any last minute questions? I'm going to once again drop the link to our web calendar in the chat if you are interested in any upcoming events. I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so if you have them, get them in now. You could also, oh, Bill Yellen is saying, look at welcometothe-savoy.com for more pictures.
Okay. Thanks,
Mary
Bill.
is asking, what was the name of the movie done about Lindy Hop?
Which one? There were a number of
Yeah.
movies done about Lindy Hop or featuring Lindy Hop. Can you be more specific? I'm not sure. What was the name of the movie?
It was a few years ago shown at Rosendale Theater.
Oh, yes. I don't remember the name of it. But yeah, it's about a number of dancers and whatnot doing Lindy Hop. And Linda, Chester, do you know?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It was a documentary.
Yeah.
It's called Alive and Kicking. Someone
Alive
suggested
and
that.
Kicking. Yes. very
Alive
good,
and Kicking.
Margaret. Thank you.
Yep. That's what we have me here for. Okay. Linda wishes that you were dressed up like last time. I wish we could get dressed up and go dance again. That would be great.
Yeah, that's what we did a year ago. Margaret was my partner, and we did a little demonstration of what Lindy Hop looked like. And I miss doing that, but because of COVID, oh well.
All right. If that's it on questions, I'm going to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Once again, thank you to Ron Fields. Thank you to Linda and Chester at Got to Lindy for co-hosting this event for us.
Thank you all for showing up.
Yep, very quickly, I will put in the link to the ballroom photos in a follow-up email. In case you missed it earlier in the chat, I will be sending up a follow-up email that includes a lot of these links, including to the videos that were shown during the presentation. Sometimes sharing via Zoom can get a little choppy, so I'll make sure that those links get sent out to everyone. I'm just writing down the name to make sure I don't forget. And any further questions? Going
once, twice. Feel free to email me if you have my email about questions and such. I have no problems answering questions as long as you don't have a problem with when I answer them. But if you're in any way curious about Lindy Hop, the dance, I'd be more than happy to quell your curiosity. And I encourage everybody who doesn't already dance to learn how to do so.
All right, thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. I'm going to end the program. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rob.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your assistance, Linda, Chester, Margaret. I appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate you coming out and doing this.
Yeah.